Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here. So today I'm going to be talking about security for humans, but to help me give this talk, I'd like to get some demographics here. How many of you would identify as developers? Okay, a lot. Operations? Okay. I know people wear a lot of hats, so just primary identification. Security? Okay, a few. Business? Okay, not very many. Okay. All right, so yeah, a little bit about me. My name is Dustin Collins. I've been organizing the Boston DevOps meetup for a couple years now. I'm also the developer advocate for Conjure, which is, we do identity and access management for human and non-human actors. So as part of these roles, I've talked to a lot of people about DevOps, and at the meetup and through Conjure, I've talked to a lot of people about DevOps and security. The interesting thing there is that a lot of those conversations were under NDAs and not just publicly available. So I'm not going to name any names, but there are a few patterns around security I'd like to share today. So when we're talking about security, huge topic, so I want to set some expectations. The talk is not about patching exploits, network security, container breakout, insider threats, cloud, encryption, intrusion analysis, security tooling, but it is about integrating security into modern workflows, managing conflicts of interest, basically people. So when we start talking about DevOps and security, usually something like this comes up. Sorry, Dave, I can't let you do that. And this is the attitude we're trying to get around because usually enterprises start this DevOps initiative and they get really good success with a project or two, and then they have to go talk to the security team. And that doesn't go so well because they've been doing things their own way, and now we need to figure out a way to roll this out to the rest of the organization. There's also the point that security is really high risk and low reward. If you're doing it right, nobody's sure you've done anything at all. So an interesting thing here is this graph is from a previous job I worked. So every week at the end of our sprints, we would ask people during our retrospectives how happy you are, 1 to 5. Not how happy you are delivering for the business or how happy you are delivering a set of story points. How happy you are as a person working here 40 hours a week. So the high points in this graph, they're usually things around, we got a product out, we felt like we were on a company retreat, everybody gave a 5, things like that. The low points in the graph are interesting because usually they were production outages, really emergencies, you know, people during that week, they were just doing a lot of firefighting and they didn't like that. But the other low points in the graph that weren't emergencies were anything involving security work. So, like, not even emergency security work, any security work. People are not happy doing this. I think the reason for this is that there are a lot of unintended consequences for security work in complex systems. So you can have one little change and just take everything down, and I think we as humans are just wired to see a big catastrophe and assume that there must be a big cause to it, and that's really not the case here. So for some examples of these unintended consequences. So we have a developer that needs to use a new API to fetch some geodata. She downloads the secret token and Git ignores it for development, keeping it out of source control, which is great. But now the app breaks in production because there's no way to access the secret. I think Git ignoring, so when we take a holistic viewpoint on security workflows, Git ignoring is a bad idea. When we talk about, I think in the last 2 State of the DevOps reports, the #1 factor to a high velocity organization is being able to recreate your production environment from source control. And so we've got our code, we've got our configuration management, but the security stuff kind of lives in this nebulous world outside of it because we can't just check it into source. For operations, an example is we need to roll out containers for our version 2 of our next internal pass. So we bake the secrets into Docker images. And now password rotation requires a redeploy of our application. Security team isn't happy about this. Obviously, these things should be able to happen out of band. Security. Need to keep an inventory of running services. So they do some due diligence, roll out a tool to do it through an internal web dashboard. The tool doesn't have an API, so now security is the bottleneck to launching new services. Business user. You have your CTO, your any C-level, director level. So they go to a conference like this. They talk to a vendor, and they're all psyched, like, we can do this now. So they go ahead and buy the contract, and now everybody's going to use this at our company because it's so great. But it only works on AWS. So now the dev workflows are full of workarounds because the developers don't write code on AWS, they write it locally. Ops is now constrained to one platform, and security isn't happy with the built-in reporting, so they're relegated to filing help desk tickets. Like, we want this feature, we want this feature. This is like a core thing for their business, so sending out a support request and then waiting for 2 or 3 weeks for what you need really isn't great. Really what we end up with is something like the Donner Party. So for anybody that's not familiar with the Donner Party, this was a group of travelers in the 1840s. They headed out west to the promised land of continuous delivery. Halfway through, they got snowed under by miscommunication and unclear expectations, and they ended up eating each other. This is kind of the case in a lot of large organizations when we're talking about integrating DevOps and security. So I work with this really smart guy, Dan Warner. He's our director of UX at Conjure. And so he said, addressing the individual needs of the distinct user personas and paying special attention to the points at which their needs intersect is the key to driving adoption, usage, and ultimately delivering a successful product experience. So I work at a security company, but I think this idea is really applicable if you're chaining together a bunch of tools internally to put together a security pipeline. If you're using open source, if you're using vendors, it doesn't matter. You still have to have this eye toward a holistic perspective, because security is kind of like the kraken in the middle of your organization with tentacles that reach out into everything. So one of the great ways to do this, and I think this is something we can really learn from the UX crowd, are user personas. So just briefly, these are our user personas we use at Conjure. So we have app developer. I'm not going to go through each of these, but I think the main points that they have in common is that we have an overview, we have what their skill level is, what they use, some actual quotes from them to kind of get their frame of mind, and then some stories. Like, as a developer, I want to write and test features without thinking about security so I can continuously deliver. So we have an app developer, an ops guy, security user, and business user. So what I'm really talking about here is, I think, especially in large organizations, there's a need for a cross-functional security UX team, because it's really, really easy when you're working on security problems to kind of get in your little bubble and disregard what other people need. If just your security team is in charge of this, they might not be aware of the concerns that the app or dev team, the dev or ops teams need. So I don't think this should be a full-time team per se. I guess it depends on how large your organization is, but there's a real gap here, and I think a security UX team could do this. So part of the things they do is create and maintain user personas. So the thing about these personas is that they're not static, they're living. So your developers might think one way and then think another way 6 months from now. So you can't just have this old frame of reference to meet their needs. Conducting user interviews, again, this is coming from UX, talking to people about their workflows and what they need. And then sharing data with stakeholders. So I think this is super important, especially from a security perspective. So really the number one blocker to compliance for a lot of companies is visibility. Like you don't even know what's going on in your system. So if you feel that way already when you're running sort of a pets infrastructure, and then you move to cattle, you're having like Kubernetes clusters and all these crazy infrastructure things that, you know, they may live for maybe 20 seconds, but they get their job done. Part of getting their job done was pulling a secret from somewhere. So if this isn't visible to anybody in the organization, that's a real blocker, because that's the same sort of thing audit folks are going to be asking you for. Another important thing is, I think this team are the right people to hold postmortems for security issues. I've been in postmortems that were led by just one section. So a postmortem for a security issue really needs to involve the stakeholders, right? We need DevOps, security, and the business user in there. And if one of these teams conducts it, they're naturally going to, it's not going to be a productive postmortem, because they're going to be hedging their bets and trying to minimize their fault. I don't want to say fault. They want to minimize their involvement in what happened. So I think you need a step removed here, people to help out with that. And then, yeah, lastly, raise the visibility of how security works. Okay, so I don't like talks without takeaways, so these are my takeaways. So through talking with a lot of folks at the DevOps meetup, and talking with a lot of internal people in these NDA conversations, these are my list of things to avoid in security workflows. So developer workflows that depend on Git ignoring credentials. You end up with secrets on developer machines. If you try to go then and like automate secret rotations, then this becomes really difficult. Interestingly enough, that if you go through the docs of some tools, they actually recommend this pattern. I made pull requests to various tools to get this out and not stop recommending this pattern. So just watch out for that. Back to the ops example, credential rotation schemes that required redeploys. These are really things that should be able to be done out of band. So credential rotations, privilege escalations, you don't want to have to wait for a redeploy of your application to cause a problem that needs solved right now. If you have more than one way to access credentials that depend on your environment, it's also a red flag. The developers should be able to pull it the same way the production servers pull your secrets. Cloud-specific solutions really just tie you, they kind of tie your hands. Security tools without programmable APIs. So this is a big thing. So if we're going to try to raise the visibility of security in organizations, one of the best ways to do that is through code. So you should really be expressing your security policy as code. That opens up some interesting workflows, really, because if you can express your policy as code, then you can do things like having pull requests on a privilege escalation, and then you have your full history tracked through Git of what's going on with your policies. This one's a little controversial, but shoehorning security into collaborative tools, it limits their effectiveness. So tools like Chef, Jenkins, etcd, Docker, trying to just attach security to the side of these tools really kind of undermines what they're for. So, for example, if you start putting secrets into your Chef server, you save it to node attributes and upload it to your Chef server, then you have to start locking your Chef server down. And when you start locking your Chef server down, then it's harder for your developers to interact with it. Last one is not checking your policy into source code, kind of a continuation of that. And I think there's 3 stages of this if you're not doing this now. And I think at the bare minimum, just plain text is great. Like the ops team has access to the production servers, plain text, checked into GitHub. Okay, that's a start. I think the second one is working on that programmable API. That way people can collaborate with it. The problem with just having the API though is that tracking the current state of the system becomes really hard because it's sort of like sudoing on a machine and running a bunch of stuff and then sudoing back off or logging out. So what we're really looking for here is security policy as code. Okay, that's my talk. You can see me on Twitter at DustinMM80. There's my email, and I also write at dustinrcollins.com.